Recently, there were 2 new Black Templar specific units released. They have some cool designs and adapt more general marine roles to the chapter very well. So naturally, I wanted to try my hand at building them. And in the process, it highlighted some different approaches to kit bashing and converting. I always pay attention to new model releases, because as someone who loves kit bashing and converting, they're often quite a bit more than just new minis. Obviously, it is a new model to build out and convert, or use parts of in other projects, but a lot of the time there's also the optional parts that go in the bits box for future builds, or will be easy to get second hand. The models often come with new lore, which gives insight and ideas as to how to convert and kit bash that unit or others like it, to upgrade what it's going for. Even outside of getting the model itself, it's worth seeing what the official look of certain elements are, like if I want to recreate specific parts for other builds. And if it's a new unit, it adds a new type of role for the faction that can be an excuse to fit other conversions into the army with. For the new models, there's the Execrator, a new type of chaplain, but specifically fits into the Black Templar's preferred melee styles, performing the usual chaplain duties of upholding chapter creeds and inspiring battle brothers, but doing so with feats of martial prowess on the front lines. My take on this unit is inspired by this great chaplain design by Pico Nico on Instagram, which even pushes some of the Execrator's elements further, for conversion building on new official models. Then there's the other new unit, the Crusade Ancient. An Ancient is a standard bearer that normally carries a banner, a relic honouring a company's heraldry and deeds. But Black Templars don't have the traditional company structure, instead forming into more impromptu crusade fleets. These crusades do get their own heraldry, which Black Templars normally display on their armour, and the new Ancient represents them too, either with a large crusade shield or other symbology associated with the crusade. I do like the new model, but I did have enough bits spare to convert this unit from, which is a good example of how kit bashing some units naturally leads well into even more kit bashes, through both leftover bits carried forward and developing learned building techniques. Moving on to the building of the Execrator, its running pose really lent itself to adding a jump pack, with a lot of implied motion, like many of the usual jump pack units, and it even works with the Execrator's preaching from the frontline lore, allowing it to jump to the front and into enemy lines very quickly. Trying to be faithful to the inspiration art, I wanted to use the large turbine style of jump pack, which I do prefer myself. Unfortunately for me, the Horus Heresy Mark II Assault Marine kit recently came out with that style of jump pack. So I picked some up from eBay and they fit well, with simple connection points making them easy to attach in place of the Chaplain's normal power pack, just with one of the Execrator's power pack decorations attached to the top, with a skull from the Battlefield Trophies kit stuck in the centre of it. For some of the Execrator's weaponry, I started with the arm made to hold out a pistol. The kit has the options for a bolt or flamer pistol, but not the plasma I wanted, so I salvaged the kit's hand and weapon grip, and cut up a spare plasma pistol part I had in a similar way to swap it in. I did initially try to match the art's large skull shoulders too, making use of some parts from another Black Templar unit, the Castellan. However, those large skull shoulders are divided very weirdly, and I didn't want to cut them up, as they'd make the Castellan I have spare unusable on its own. As an alternative, I made some blue stuff moulds of the shoulders to recast them with green stuff, which copied the detail well, but they didn't scale well or fit on the normal marine shoulder pads neatly enough. There were potential solutions to that, but I wanted to keep these conversions quick, and I'd spent enough time on these already, so I just went with the Execrator's normal shoulders, which at least have some small skulls on them. For the last big part of the Execrator, I wanted to include the Power Fist, and with the model's pose and loadout, it reminded me of how the Assault class from Space Marine 2 plays, jumping forward, melee weapon ready to swing. So I knew I wanted a Power Fist on the other arm, pointing forwards, angled up and out, similar to an older Marine I made. Unfortunately for me, right-handed Power Fists aren't as common as left-handed ones. I did end up getting one from a Tartarus Terminator, but to actually connect it to the model, I used a spare Marine arm that normally holds a gun, since it had the right sort of bend at the elbow. I cut both the arms down to what I needed to connect them, then also used a bit of green stuff so the arm connected at the torso exactly how I wanted. I tried to add some creases to the green stuff like you see at other power armor joints, which wasn't perfect, but that part ends up mostly covered by the shoulder pad and crusade shield anyway. Then moving on to the smaller parts of this model, I re-added the Power Fists cable that I needed to cut away when reposing, replacing it with some 1.5mm wrapped wire from Zinja Industries. To decorate the plain fist, I initially wanted to try and reuse some of the Execrator's Crozius parts, but they were too big and obscured the fist too much, so I just went with a random small part from my bits box which had a skull on it to keep it all consistent. Then I just finished this unit's building off by adding some 1.5mm chain to the gun and adding the kit's Crusade shield part. For the Crusade Ancient I converted, this is something made entirely with bits I already had, even mostly from previous builds I've shown on my channel. For my Dreadnought Grimaldus build, I needed to get a specific part for its giant Crozius, which was the standard from a Blade Guard Ancient. That unit as a whole isn't common, only coming in a set, so it's hard to get specific bits for, and I was only able to get the whole model second hand, already glued together. So after using the standard part for the Dreadnought, the rest of the Ancient just sat in my bits box for months, but it then became the perfect starting point for converting a Crusade Ancient. The first change I made to the model was to give it a sword, which I did by swapping its left hand for one which was left over from the squad of Blade Guards I made a video on. Then, the central part of the model is the Crusade Standard, which I figured would be fun to make. I opted to go with a giant shield version, but the Armageddon Crusade specific one could also easily be done. Just swapping one of the parts out with another spare sword, whatever marine detail bits to hand, chains, and some dead orc skull probably from the Skulls or Battlefield Trophies kit. But to make the shield standard for mine, I started with the banner pole. I had planned to use round plastic rods, but didn't actually have the right size of 2mm to match the pole the model is already holding. I ended up making the pole out of Grey Knight halberds that I just trimmed down all the extra bits from and connected with larger hollow plastic rod, which was a bit wonky, but would be mostly obscured by other parts later. The next biggest part I got together was the large Crusade shield, central to the standard. I made something pretty similar for a shoulder decoration on my Dreadnought Grimaldus, so I just repeated the same initial steps, using a grid to cut the general shield shape out of 1mm plasticard, sanding the edges smooth, scribing a line to make the different sections easier to paint later, then bending it in a slight curve. The official Crusade Ancient also has these metal bits holding its shield, which I like the look of, so I tried to copy that, with small rectangles of 0.5mm plasticard on the front and sides, with rivets made from 1mm plastic rod. To go on top of the pole, I used a BT relic skull placed inside a Blade Guard's iron halo, just like the one I made for one of my Blade Guards. I did also like the sword of the other option of the official Ancient Standard, so I quickly threw together a very basic sheathed sword, using a handle left over from my Blade Guards, and plasticard roughly cut into a sheath shape to glue behind the shield. As is Black Templar practice, I attached some 1.5mm chains around the wrists, weapon handles, and a few other places. Then for all the standard scripture and tapestry, I used a similar method to the one I tried for my Blade Guards, which is just rolling green stuff out very flat, letting it set a little, and cutting it into strips. I rolled the top of those strips around the bannered poles, lightly pressed some folds into them, and let it set overnight at a slight angle to give it a bit of a windswept look. Then for some final details, on the sides of the poles, I used weapon pommels left over from the axes I cut up for one of my previous Blade Guards, and I added a lantern to the top of the unit's power pack. And that covers the building for both the new units. For the painting, I did my usual Black Templar scheme, which I'll not go into too much detail about, as I've done quite a few videos which also have it. I start off with a dark black primer spray of Chaos Black, and to build up some depth, I heavily dry brush the slightly lighter Corvus Black, then dry brush the dark grey Eshin Grey, and lightly dry brush a medium grey of Dawnstone as some rough highlights, or to prepare other areas that will be painted in lighter colours later. All the bones, tabard and scripture areas are painted with Rakarth flesh, the golden trim is Runelord brass, and the silver metal is Iron Warriors. The weapon casings, wires, purity seal wax stamps and secondary banners are painted with corn red, and any leather parts are painted with dried bark. Smaller parts like the eyes are Execrator orange, and the white for the standard shield stripe and plasma gun coils are grey sear. And for any blue glow effects, like those plasma coils or the power sword, get a coat of athematic blue contrast. The bases get a coat of Doomball brown just to make sure no black gets through the following layer of Martian Iron Crust texture paste. For smaller details, like on all the Crusade shields or plain shoulder pads, I use some decals from the Black Templar transfer sheet, just picking out some basic skull, sword and chapter logo ones. I initially tried to copy the official Crusade shields design, but the decals I grabbed were a bit too small, so I added some skull and chains since they always fit Black Templar styles. I did the full length process to ensure the decals went on as well as possible. Firstly preparing the areas with the gloss ard coat for a smooth surface, then adding the decals after soaking them in water, then adding a bit of decal softener on top so they adhere to the surface properly. Then, once that's all dried, I went over them with the matte Lamium Medium to make sure there were no glossy parts left. The next step was to shade the models, using Nuln Oil over the black and silver parts, Agrax Earthshade for red, brown and cream parts, including the base, then Reikland Flesh Shade for the gold, also mixing a little in with the other washes because I like the warm earthy tint it adds. Then to bring back a bit of brightness on the raised parts and edges of the model, I got to highlighting. And there's something slightly different I tried with these models to help smooth the transition to some of the brighter colours of the highlights, and that is doing them in two parts. One broader highlight mixing the original paint with a brighter shade, then a finer highlight, normally just on the edges with that brighter shade alone. So for example with the reds, I'd do the broad highlight on raised and upward facing areas, mixing corn red and Wazdaka red, then I'd do the fine edge highlights with just Wazdaka red. On the black armour I use Dawnstone and Administratum Grey, on the bones, tabards and scripture I use Wraithbone, on the reds I use Wazdaka red, Canoptic Alloy for the gold, Mournfang Brown for the browns, Toothing Coats is Surcoat Silver for the silver, and Execrator Orange to dry brush highlight the bases. And the finishing touch is all the scripture writing, but since I can't do freehand painting well that small, I use a fine-tipped pen instead. I usually just do random scribbles and dots as small and lightly as I can manage, but for variety I added a few different bits for the Ancient's banner, in the form of letters at the start of paragraphs, some simple symbols between them, and boxes around some. And that's how I made these new additions to the Black Templar ranks. I think I did pretty well converting and upgrading while trying out new parts and also reusing parts from previous builds too. These were a good follow-up to my recent batch of Black Templars, but I'm not 100% sure what to add to them next. Maybe something else leading up to a Dreadnought conversion? Let me know what you think. And in the meantime, I'm figuring out another big mech build and continuing to flesh out my AdMech. If you want to see my progress on that, you can find more frequent posts from me on other sites like Twitter and Instagram. You can get some of the kits I used in this build via my Element Games affiliate links in the description, or you can support me more directly on Patreon. I'd like to thank those currently supporting me on Patreon, who are Kyra, Morse Going Free, The Lich's Laboratory, Philip Mitchell, Mechlord of the Bad Dragon Clan, Gamrus, Always Abe, Quirky Perceptions, Beedwag, PP, Fozea, Yaroslav Altunin, and Darren.